The sound of shattering glass echoed through the high-rise office as Sarah Maxwell's manicured hand slammed against her mahogany desk. Her assistant flinched, but Victoria didn't notice. She was too busy staring at the email that had just cost her company millions. Someone was going to pay for this mistake, and it would not be her. "Cancel everything," she commanded, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. "Get me on the next flight to Chicago. I do not care what it costs." The assistant scurried away, leaving Victoria alone with her rage and the Manhattan skyline that usually made her feel like she owned the world. At 35, Sarah had everything society said she should want. She was the youngest female CEO in New York's competitive finance sector. Her wardrobe cost more than most people's cars. The gossip columns called her Manhattan's most eligible bachelorette, though she considered relationships a waste of time. Success was her only companion, and it had served her well so far. What those glossy magazine profiles failed to mention was how Victoria achieved such stunning success. They didn't talk about the trail of broken careers she left behind, or how her employees called her the volcano, because her eruptions destroyed everything in their path. Victoria saw kindness as weakness, and weakness was something she had purged from her life long ago. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her office as she gathered her things. Her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a woman most people would call beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and darker hair styled into submission. But there was something cold in her eyes, something that had been there so long she no longer noticed it herself. The drive to JFK was a blur of angry phone calls and email responses typed with furious precision. Her driver knew better than to attempt conversation. The last one who tried had been fired on the spot. By the time they reached the airport, Victoria had formulated exactly how she would destroy the Chicago team that had botched the merger she'd spent months orchestrating. JFK was packed with holiday travelers, their festive spirits and excited chatter grating against Victoria's already frayed nerves. She bypassed the main security line, her first-class status and practiced glare clearing a path through the crowd. A child's crying made her jaw clench. A teenager's laughter caused her fingers to tighten around her designer bag's leather strap. That's when she first saw him. The young man in the military fatigues was struggling with his duffel bag at the security checkpoint, holding up the line as he tried to manage his belongings with one arm. His other arm ended in an empty sleeve, pinned neatly to his uniform. Victoria felt her blood pressure spike. Of all days, she did not have time for this. "Some of us have actual places to be," she muttered loudly enough for those around her to hear. The soldier glanced back, his face flushing slightly as he tried to move faster. A nearby woman shot Victoria a horrified look, but Victoria had spent years perfecting her ability to ignore such judgmental stares. Finally, through security, Victoria's mood had deteriorated further. Her flight was delayed by 30 minutes. The airport Wi-Fi was painfully slow. The coffee shop had spelled her name wrong. Each minor inconvenience felt like a personal attack, stoking the fury that always simmered just beneath her polished surface. She was the last to board the plane, a tactical choice to minimize time spent in the cramped space. As she walked down the aisle to her first-class seat, she spotted a familiar uniform. The same soldier from security was seated in coach, still awkwardly trying to store his bag in the overhead compartment with one arm. Victoria's seat gave her a clear view of the struggle. She watched as other passengers offered to help, her lip curling in derision at what she saw as unnecessary coddling. When the flight attendant came by to check if she needed anything, Victoria spoke just loud enough to carry. "I paid for first class to avoid this kind of circus. If I wanted to watch amateur hour, I would have booked coach." The flight attendant's professional smile faltered. Several nearby passengers turned to stare. The soldier kept his eyes forward, but his shoulders stiffened, making it clear he had heard every word. Victoria felt a familiar rush of satisfaction. Making others uncomfortable was a power move she had mastered long ago. The plane began its journey to the runway as Sarah pulled out her tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen as she reviewed the merger documents again. Each page fueled her anger further. The Chicago team had missed crucial details, overlooked obvious red flags, and now everything was falling apart. Tomorrow's emergency meeting would be a bloodbath, and she was already planning exactly how she would destroy each person responsible. Her focus was interrupted by movement in the aisle. The soldier was making his way to the bathroom, his movements careful and measured. Sarah noticed how young he looked, probably in his early 20s, with a face that still held traces of boyhood despite the obvious weight in his eyes. For a fraction of a second, something stirred in her chest. A memory, perhaps, or a feeling she had buried long ago. She pushed it away immediately. Sentiment was for weak people, and Sarah Maxwell had not become who she was by caring about strangers' stories. She had learned that lesson early in life, watching her own father's kind heart and generous nature lead their family into bankruptcy. While other little girls were playing with dolls, Sarah was watching repo men take their furniture. While her classmates went on summer vacations, she was wearing second-hand clothes and learning that nice people finish last. The memory made her grip her tablet tighter. That scared little girl was gone, replaced by a woman who would never be powerless again. She had clawed her way out of that life through sheer determination and ruthlessness. Every cruel word, every career she had ruined, every person she had stepped on to reach the top. They had all been necessary sacrifices on the altar of success. A flight attendant approached with a drink cart, offering Sarah a selection of premium beverages. As she ordered her usual vodka tonic, she could hear commotion from the coach section. The soldier appeared to be having trouble navigating back to his seat due to turbulence, and other passengers were scrambling to help him. "Pathetic," Sarah muttered, loud enough for the flight attendant to hear. "If you cannot handle yourself independently, you should not be traveling alone. Some of us are trying to work here." The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she handed Sarah her drink, spilling a few drops on Sarah's expensive silk blouse. Sarah's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I expect this airline to compensate me for this blouse. It costs more than you make in a month." More passengers were staring now, their faces showing various degrees of shock and disgust. Sarah felt powerful in their judgment. Let them stare. Let them whisper. Their opinions meant nothing to her. She was the one flying first class, wearing clothes they could never afford, living a life they could only dream about. The remainder of the flight passed in a blur of emails and strategic planning. Sarah pointedly ignored the occasional sounds from coach class, the quiet murmur of conversations, and the subtle whispers that she knew were about her. She was used to being talked about, being the subject of rumors and gossip. Success always bred jealousy, and she wore their hatred like a badge of honor. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Sarah allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Tomorrow, she would remind everyone why she was feared in the business world. She would salvage this merger through sheer force of will, leaving behind a trail of destroyed careers and shattered egos. Just another day in the life she had built for herself. The landing was smooth, but Sarah remained in her seat as others began to deplane. She never rushed, never joined the undignified scramble of passengers eager to exit. From her seat, she could observe the soldier gathering his belongings, still struggling but refusing help from other passengers now. His resilience irritated her even more than his earlier weakness had. "If you cannot handle standard tasks, perhaps you should consider a different career path," she said coldly as he passed her seat, her voice carrying clearly despite the ambient noise of the plane. "The military clearly is not suitable for everyone." The words hung in the air like poison. Several passengers gasped audibly. An elderly man a few rows ahead turned to glare at her. The soldier kept walking, his back straight and his head high, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his remaining hand. She felt no remorse. The world was harsh, and she was merely stating what others were too cowardly to say. Kindness was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and she had no intention of starting now. What Sarah did not know, could not know, was that her words would come back to haunt her in ways she could never imagine. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to deplane, the universe was already setting in motion a chain of events that would shatter her carefully constructed world. The news that awaited her tomorrow would force her to confront not just the consequences of her actions, but the very foundation of who she had become. The peninsula. Chicago stood like a gleaming monument to luxury against the night sky, its lights sparkling alongside the stars. Sarah Maxwell swept through the opulent lobby, her designer heels striking the marble floors with military precision. The staff scrambled to attention at her approach, recognizing the storm in her eyes and the power in her stride. Her reputation preceded her even here, hundreds of miles from her New York power base. Her corner suite on the 40th floor offered a commanding view of Michigan Avenue, a vista she had specifically requested. Sarah always chose rooms with views like this. They reminded her of how far she had climbed from her humble beginnings, how thoroughly she had buried that desperate little girl who once wore second-hand clothes and ate generic brand cereal. The suite itself was a masterpiece of luxury. Italian marble in the bathroom, hand-painted silk wallpaper, furniture that cost more than some cars. Sarah barely noticed any of it as she spread dozens of documents across the dining table, creating a war room for tomorrow's battle. The merger documents told a story of incompetence that made her teeth grind. Every page revealed new mistakes, overlooked details, missed opportunities that threatened to destroy months of careful planning. Outside her window, Chicago lived its evening life. Thousands of tiny lights moved through the streets below, each one representing a person living their insignificant life, unaware that above them, Sarah Maxwell was preparing to destroy careers and shatter lives. The thought brought a familiar satisfaction. Power was her drug of choice, and tomorrow she would indulge heavily. The room service waiter who brought her dinner at 9 p.m. nearly dropped the tray when he met her icy stare. Sarah had ordered a Caesar salad and a bottle of expensive red wine, though food was the last thing on her mind. The salad would go largely untouched, but the wine would fuel her through hours of preparation. She had learned long ago that hunger kept her sharp, kept the edge that had carved her path to the top. As she worked, her mind occasionally wandered back to the incident on the plane. The soldier's face flashed in her memory, the hurt in his eyes when she had made her cruel remarks. Sarah pushed these thoughts away with practiced ease. Guilt was a useless emotion, one she had excised from her emotional repertoire years ago. Success required sacrifice, and if that meant sacrificing basic human kindness, so be it. Her phone buzzed constantly with emails and messages from her New York office. News of her sudden trip to Chicago had sparked a panic among her employees. They knew what it meant when Sarah Maxwell made unexpected appearances. They had seen too many colleagues fall to her fury, too many careers end in her wake. Their fear fed her sense of power, another reminder of how far she had come from being that powerless child watching repo men take her family's furniture. The night deepened outside her window as Sarah refined her attack plan for tomorrow. The termination papers for 3 senior executives were already drafted, their careers soon to be reduced to ashes. The entire Chicago office would learn once again why her nickname, the Destroyer, was well earned. She had orchestrated similar purges before, each one cementing her reputation as a corporate executioner. Her wine glass emptied and refilled as the hours ticked by. The alcohol didn't soften her edges anymore. Nothing did. Sarah had spent years building her armor, crafting herself into a weapon aimed at the heart of corporate America. Every cruel word, every destroyed career, every act of ruthlessness had been a brick in the wall she built around herself. That wall protected her from weakness, from the vulnerability that had once defined her life. Midnight came and went, but Sarah barely noticed. She was lost in financial reports and market analyses, finding more ammunition for tomorrow's confrontation. Each mistake she uncovered felt like a personal insult, another reason to unleash her fury. The Chicago team had not just failed, they had failed her, and that was unforgivable. The city lights continued their dance beyond her window, but Sarah was blind to their beauty. Her world had narrowed to the task at hand, to the meticulous planning of professional executions. Tomorrow would be a bloodbath, and she would be the one wielding the knife. The thought should have troubled her, but Sarah had long since stopped questioning the cost of her success. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to creep in at the edges of her consciousness. Sarah fought it off with more wine and sheer determination. She had learned early in her career that sleep was a luxury afforded to those who hadn't clawed their way up from nothing. Success required sacrifice, and comfort was always the first thing to go. The documents before her blurred slightly as her eyes grew heavy. Numbers danced across spreadsheets, telling stories of failure and incompetence that would soon be punished. Sarah allowed herself a small, cold smile. Tomorrow, she would remind everyone why she was feared in the business world. Tomorrow, she would add more casualties to her long list of professional victims. What Sarah couldn't know, as she finally prepared for bed in the early hours of the morning, was that the universe had other plans. The news that awaited her would shake the very foundation of her carefully constructed world. Her act of cruelty on the plane would return to haunt her in ways she could never imagine, forcing her to confront not just her actions, but the very person she had become. As she finally slipped between the luxurious sheets, Sarah's last thoughts were of tomorrow's planned destruction. She fell asleep with that cold smile still playing on her lips, unaware that in less than 12 hours her entire world would be turned upside down. The woman who had built her life on others' pain was about to learn a lesson in humanity that would shatter everything she thought she knew about power, success, and the true cost of cruelty. Dawn broke over Chicago with ruthless efficiency, much like the woman watching it from her 40th floor suite. Sarah Maxwell had been awake since 4 a.m., her body running on coffee and determination. The morning light painted the city in shades of gold, but she was focused on her reflection in the bathroom mirror, ensuring every detail of her appearance conveyed power. Her charcoal gray suit was armor, her perfectly styled hair a helmet, her blood-red lipstick war paint. The Peninsula's breakfast service delivered her morning fuel precisely at 6 a.m., a protein-rich meal she would need for the day ahead, though her stomach churned with anticipation of the coming confrontation. Sarah had already received 17 emails from her New York office, each one conveying new information about the merger disaster. The Chicago team's incompetence ran deeper than even she had initially suspected. The morning newspapers waited outside her door, their headlines screaming about market volatility and corporate mergers. Sarah picked them up automatically, her mind already racing through the day's battle plans. She had scheduled the emergency meeting for 9 a.m. sharp, choosing the early hour deliberately to catch her victims off guard. Years of experience had taught her that people were most vulnerable, most likely to break, in the early morning hours. Chicago's streets were already alive with activity as her private car carried her toward the office building. The city moved with a different rhythm than New York, a pace that felt foreign and slightly off-kilter to Sarah's Manhattan-tuned senses. Her driver, arranged by the local office, maintained a respectful silence. Word of her reputation had clearly reached even the car service. The Chicago office occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown skyscraper. As Sarah's elevator climbed toward the executive floor, she could feel the building's energy shift. News of her arrival had spread like wildfire, and she could almost taste the fear in the air. Her heels clicked against the marble floor of the reception area, the sound like a countdown to execution. Early morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space that would soon become a battlefield. The office was modern and expensively furnished, all glass and chrome and power. Support staff scurried out of her path like mice fleeing a hawk. Sarah allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Fear was a currency she traded in expertly. Her temporary office, commandeered from the Chicago division head, offered a pristine view of Lake Michigan. Sarah settled behind the massive desk, arranging her documents with military precision. The termination papers sat in crisp manila folders, each one representing a career she would end today. The morning light caught the gold band of her watch as she checked the time. 30 minutes until the meeting that would remind everyone why she was called the Destroyer. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of unusual movement in the office beyond her door. Sarah noticed increased activity, hushed conversations, and staff members huddled around computers and phones. She dismissed it initially, assuming it was simply the normal panic that preceded one of her professional executions. But there was something different about this energy, something that felt less like fear and more like shock. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email, then another and another. The subject lines caught her attention. They all referenced a news story, something about a soldier. Sarah's finger hovered over her phone screen, a sudden unease creeping through her carefully maintained composure. Before she could open any of the emails, her assistant burst through the door, face pale and tablet in hand. The news article's headline hit Sarah like a physical blow. The soldier from the plane, the one whose struggle she had mocked so carelessly, was now splashed across every major news outlet in the country. His name was Michael Anderson, and he wasn't just any soldier. He was a decorated war hero who had lost his arm saving an entire unit of fellow soldiers. The mission details were still classified, but sources reported he had single-handedly held off enemy forces, allowing dozens of his comrades to reach safety. Sarah's throat went dry as she read further. Anderson had been returning from receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the nation's highest military honors. The ceremony had been private due to the classified nature of his actions, but now the story was breaking nationwide, and witnesses from the plane were talking. Social media was exploding with accounts of how a heartless executive had publicly mocked and berated a genuine American hero. The blood drained from Sarah's face as she scrolled through the coverage. Videos were already surfacing, captured by passengers' phones. Her own voice, dripping with contempt, played back at her through tinny speakers. The headlines were brutal. Corporate executive mocks wounded war hero. Wall Street's finest shows America's worst. Decorated soldier humiliated on flight home from award ceremony. But worse were the personal details emerging about Anderson. He was 24 years old, the son of a single mother who had worked 3 jobs to support him. He had joined the military to pay for his sister's medical treatment. The sister who had died while he was deployed, making his sacrifice even more poignant. Every new detail was like a dagger to Sarah's carefully constructed facade. Her phone would not stop ringing. The New York office was in crisis mode. The company's stock was already taking a hit as the story went viral. Investors were expressing concern about the leadership of someone who would treat a military hero with such disdain. Social media was on fire with calls for her resignation. Sarah Maxwell, who had built her career on being feared, was quickly becoming one of the most hated people in America. The morning sun continued to stream through the office windows, but it no longer felt warming. Instead, it felt like a spotlight, exposing every dark corner of her character to the world's judgment. The termination papers on her desk now seemed absurdly trivial. The merger crisis that had brought her to Chicago paled in comparison to the personal and professional catastrophe unfolding around her. Her assistant reappeared with more news. Anderson was scheduled to appear on several major morning shows tomorrow. His story had captured the nation's attention, and his humble response to her cruelty only made him more sympathetic. While Sarah had been sleeping in her luxury suite, planning corporate executions, social media had been turning him into a symbol of everything that was right about America, and her into everything that was wrong. The irony was not lost on Sarah. She had come to Chicago to destroy careers, to remind everyone of her power. Instead, she was watching her own carefully built world crumble in real time. Every cruel word she had spoken on that plane was coming back to her, amplified by the megaphone of national media. Every contemptuous glance, every dismissive gesture had been captured and was being dissected by millions. The conference room where she had planned to conduct her professional executions was now filled with senior executives in crisis management mode. PR teams were being assembled, press statements were being drafted, but Sarah barely heard their discussions. For the first time in her adult life, she felt something she had thought she had banished forever: shame. As the morning wore on, more details about Anderson emerged. His unit members were coming forward with stories of his bravery, his kindness, his unwavering dedication to his fellow soldiers. The contrast between his character and hers was stark and damning. He had sacrificed his arm to save others. She had sacrificed her humanity to save herself. Sarah stared out at the Chicago skyline, but she no longer saw the view that represented power and success. Instead, she saw her own reflection in the glass, and for the first time in years, she really looked at what she had become. The news that had shattered her world was still spreading, still growing, still revealing new depths of her cruelty and his heroism. And somewhere in Chicago, a young soldier with an empty sleeve was unwittingly teaching her the hardest lesson of her life. True power had nothing to do with the ability to destroy, and everything to do with the courage to protect others. The next few hours unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe in the Chicago office. Sarah Maxwell watched helplessly as her empire crumbled pixel by pixel, tweet by tweet, headline by headline. The crisis management team had taken over the largest conference room, their urgent whispers and frantic typing creating a symphony of desperation. Every notification on every device seemed to bring new damage, new revelations, new depths to her public disgrace. By noon, the story had evolved beyond the initial shock. Internet sleuths had begun digging into Sarah's past, uncovering a pattern of behavior that spanned her entire career. Former employees emerged from the woodwork, sharing stories of her cruelty. Each account added another crack to her carefully constructed facade. The woman who had built her reputation on fear was watching that same reputation become her undoing. The company's stock price continued its downward spiral. Investors were calling for emergency board meetings. Client companies began quietly distancing themselves, their representatives suddenly unavailable for previously scheduled calls. The merger that had brought her to Chicago was now completely forgotten, replaced by a crisis that threatened not just her position, but the entire company's stability. Sarah's phone had become a portal to her own destruction. Every social media platform was flooded with her name, her face, her words. The videos from the plane had been edited, remixed, and shared millions of times. Amateur video analysts broke down her every expression, her every gesture, finding new layers of contempt in each frame. Behavioral experts appeared on news channels, dissecting her body language and tone, diagnosing her as a textbook example of corporate psychopathy. Meanwhile, Michael Anderson's story continued to grow, taking on almost mythical proportions. More details emerged about the classified mission that had cost him his arm. Without revealing sensitive information, his fellow soldiers painted a picture of extraordinary courage. He had not only saved his unit, but had continued fighting even after his injury, using his body to shield a wounded comrade while calling in air support. The contrast between his selfless heroism and Sarah's casual cruelty could not have been more stark. The corporate response team had drafted multiple statements, each one carefully worded to minimize damage. But Sarah knew they were just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. No amount of corporate speak could soften the impact of her caught-on-camera words. No press release could explain away the cold contempt in her voice when she had mocked a decorated war hero's disability. By mid-afternoon, the story had taken on new dimensions. Financial news outlets began investigating Sarah's business practices, uncovering a history of aggressive takeovers and questionable ethics. Human resources complaints that had been buried years ago suddenly resurfaced. Former colleagues spoke of a toxic culture of fear and intimidation that she had cultivated. Each new revelation was another nail in the coffin of her career. The board of directors called an emergency meeting for the following morning. Sarah knew what that meant. She had been in the corporate world long enough to recognize the signs of imminent execution. The same ruthless efficiency she had employed against others would now be turned against her. The irony was not lost on her as she sat in her temporary office, watching her professional life disintegrate. Outside her window, Chicago continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the glass tower. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, reminding Sarah of how quickly darkness could fall. She had spent years casting shadows over others' lives, And now those shadows were reaching back toward her with devastating effect. The PR team had strongly advised her against making any public statements, but their carefully crafted press releases were doing nothing to stem the tide of public outrage. Social media had branded her the face of corporate evil, a symbol of everything wrong with American business culture. Memes of her most contemptuous expressions spread across the internet, accompanied by increasingly creative hashtags calling for her downfall. As evening approached, the story took another unexpected turn. Journalists had tracked down Sarah's childhood history, revealing the poverty she had fought so hard to escape. Some tried to use this information to explain her behavior, to provide context for her ruthless climb to the top, but these attempts at humanizing her only seemed to make things worse. The public had little sympathy for someone who had overcome hardship only to become a source of cruelty to others. The contrast between her origin story and Michael Anderson's only heightened the public's animosity. Both had faced adversity, but while Anderson had turned his struggles into a source of strength and compassion, Sarah had allowed hers to transform her into something cold and destructive. The parallel narratives played out across news channels and social media, turning their encounter into a morality tale about choice and character. The crisis management team worked well into the night, but their efforts felt increasingly futile. Sarah's inbox filled with cancellations from business partners, speaking engagements, and charity boards. Organizations that had once competed for her attention now couldn't distance themselves fast enough. The carefully constructed network of power and influence she had built over years was unraveling in a matter of hours. Looking out over the Chicago skyline, Sarah noticed something had changed in her own reflection. The polished armor of her appearance had begun to crack. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the strain around her eyes, and her expensive suit suddenly felt like a costume rather than a symbol of power. The woman who had always measured herself against the height of buildings was starting to feel very small indeed. As midnight approached, Sarah received one final blow. Her assistant, trying to be helpful, forwarded her a newly published article about Michael Anderson's plans for the future. Despite his injury, he was working to establish a foundation to support wounded veterans and their families. The article quoted him discussing the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. He never mentioned Sarah or the plane incident directly, but his words cut deeper than any direct criticism could have. The night stretched endlessly before her as Sarah remained in the office, unable to face returning to her hotel. The cleaning staff moved quietly around her, their averted eyes telling her they too had seen the news. She had always prided herself on working longer hours than anyone else, on being the last to leave and the first to arrive. Now, those same habits felt less like dedication and more like hiding. The reality of her situation began to sink in with the weight of inevitability. Tomorrow's board meeting would almost certainly end her career. The company would distance itself from her with the same ruthless efficiency she had always admired. Her reputation, the thing she had spent decades building, had been destroyed in less than 24 hours by her own actions. The cruelest part was the realization that she had done this to herself. No competitor had brought her down. No business rival had orchestrated her fall. Sarah Maxwell, the woman who had built her success on destroying others, had finally managed to destroy herself. All it had taken was one encounter with a true hero to expose the hollowness at the core of her perceived power. In the darkened office, surrounded by the evidence of her undoing, Sarah finally began to understand the true cost of the life she had chosen. The wealth, the power, the fear she had inspired, all of it had been built on a foundation of cruelty that could no longer support the weight of public scrutiny. The news that had shattered her world had done more than destroy her career. It had forced her to see herself through the eyes of others for the first time in years. The Chicago skyline twinkled with thousands of lights, each one representing a life touched by kindness or cruelty, by courage or fear. Somewhere out there, a young soldier with an empty sleeve was preparing to turn his sacrifice into a source of hope for others. And here, In her temporary tower of power, Sarah Maxwell was learning that sometimes the most devastating news can also be the most necessary wake-up call. The question that remained was whether she could find the courage to face not just the consequences of her actions, but the fundamental truth about who she had become. Dawn broke over Chicago with a different quality than the previous morning. Sarah Maxwell stood in the same spot watching the sun rise over Lake Michigan, but everything else had changed. Her designer suit felt like a costume now, her perfect makeup a mask that could no longer hide the truth underneath. The board meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m., but Sarah already knew her fate was sealed. The morning news shows were running wall-to-wall coverage of the story. Michael Anderson had given his first television interview, and his quiet dignity only magnified Sarah's disgrace. He spoke about his military service without self-pity, about his lost arm as simply the price of protecting his fellow soldiers. When asked about the incident on the plane, he responded with a grace that felt like burning coals on Sarah's conscience. He spoke about understanding that people often lash out from their own pain, about hoping that something positive could come from the negative attention. The company's stock had dropped another 12% in pre-market trading. Sarah's email inbox overflowed with messages from her New York office, each one more urgent than the last. The crisis management team had worked through the night, but their efforts felt like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. The damage was too deep, too fundamental to be fixed with corporate spin. The board meeting itself was mercifully brief. Sarah sat at the long conference table, facing the men and women she had once intimidated into submission. Now they looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. The chairman spoke in careful corporate language about public relations challenges and protecting shareholder value. The severance package was generous, a golden parachute to ease her fall from grace. But the message was clear. Sarah Maxwell's reign of corporate terror was over. As security escorted her from the building, carrying her personal belongings in a cardboard box like countless others she had dismissed over the years, Sarah felt something she had not experienced since childhood: vulnerability. The sidewalk outside the office building seemed to stretch endlessly before her, each step taking her further from the fortress of power she had built around herself. The media circus awaited her outside. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, microphones appeared in her face like accusing fingers. Sarah moved through them in a daze, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the assault. Her driver, showing more kindness than she deserved, created a path through the crowd to her waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Sarah caught a glimpse of her own face on the news ticker running across a nearby building. The headline read, "Disgraced CEO Steps Down Amid Soldier Controversy." Back in her hotel suite, Sarah faced the ruins of her career in solitude. The phone calls had stopped. The emails slowed to a trickle. The world she had dominated just 48 hours ago had moved on, leaving her behind like yesterday's news. In the sudden silence, memories began to surface, unwanted but unstoppable. She remembered her father, worn down by years of honest work that never seemed to pay enough. She remembered her mother's quiet dignity as she shopped at secondhand stores, trying to make their limited resources stretch further. She remembered the shame of wearing donated clothes to school, of watching other children enjoy luxuries her family could never afford. Somewhere along the way, she had transformed that shame into armor, that pain into a weapon. The afternoon stretched endlessly before her. Sarah found herself doing something she had not done in years, watching old videos of herself. Interviews, conference speeches, press appearances. In each one, she saw what others had always seen. The cold eyes, the dismissive tone, the casual cruelty masked as executive efficiency. When had she become this person? When had success become synonymous with causing pain? As evening approached, Sarah received an unexpected message. Michael Anderson's foundation had issued a press release announcing its first initiative, a program to help veterans transition into corporate careers. The announcement mentioned creating a more compassionate business culture, one that valued character alongside competence. Reading between the lines, Sarah recognized it as both a challenge and an opportunity. The night brought no sleep, but it did bring clarity. Sarah spent hours writing, pouring out her story without the corporate filters and practiced deflections. She wrote about the scared little girl who had sworn never to be powerless again. She wrote about the young woman who had confused cruelty with strength. She wrote about the executive who had built an empire on others' fear, only to watch it crumble in the face of true courage. Morning found her still writing, the words flowing like a river breaking through a dam. Sarah wrote about Michael Anderson, about the moment she had mocked his struggle without knowing his story. She wrote about watching her own casual cruelty play out on national television, about seeing herself through the eyes of millions of horrified viewers. She wrote about the shame, the regret, and the desperate desire to make amends. The resulting document was raw, honest, and utterly unlike anything Sarah Maxwell had ever produced. It was not a press release or a corporate statement. It was a confession, an apology, and a promise all in one. After hours of revision and soul-searching, she sent it to every major news outlet that had covered the story. Then, for the first time in her adult life, Sarah Maxwell did something completely unexpected. She waited without trying to control the outcome. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media, which had been her judge and jury days before, began sharing excerpts from her letter. News anchors read portions on air, commenting on its unusual candor. Some dismissed it as a calculated attempt at reputation management, but others recognized the ring of truth in her words. Michael Anderson's response came through his foundation. He offered to meet with Sarah, not for publicity or profit, but for a genuine conversation about change and redemption. The meeting was arranged away from cameras and reporters in a small coffee shop on Chicago's North Side. Sarah arrived early, her designer clothes replaced by simple business casual attire, her war paint makeup stripped away. The young soldier who had unknowingly changed her life arrived precisely on time. Up close, without the filter of her previous arrogance, Sarah saw him clearly for the first time. His empty sleeve was pinned neatly, his posture straight but not rigid, his eyes kind but evaluating. They talked for hours, their conversation moving from apology to understanding to possibility. By the end of their meeting, something new had taken shape. Michael's foundation would still help veterans enter corporate life, but now it would have an unexpected partner. Sarah offered her years of business experience, her network of contacts, and, most importantly, her own story as a cautionary tale about the difference between success and true achievement. The weeks that followed brought more changes. Sarah sold her Manhattan penthouse, using much of the proceeds to fund veteran support programs. She moved into a modest apartment, trading material excess for purpose. The woman who had once commanded a corporate empire now worked alongside those she had previously looked down upon, learning lessons in humanity that no business school could teach. The media coverage gradually shifted. Stories began appearing about corporate executives participating in the Foundation's programs, about companies changing their cultures to become more inclusive and compassionate. Sarah's fall from grace became part of a larger narrative about transformation and redemption. 1 year after the infamous plane incident, Sarah stood at a podium, addressing a room full of veterans preparing to enter the business world. Her speech was not about power or success as she had once defined them. Instead, she spoke about learning humanity from those who had sacrificed for others, about finding strength in vulnerability, about building success that lifted others up rather than tearing them down. Michael sat in the front row, his presence a reminder of how a single moment of cruelty had led to an unexpected journey of transformation. The empty sleeve of his uniform was no longer a target for mockery, but a symbol of the highest form of leadership, the willingness to sacrifice for others. As Sarah concluded her speech, she looked out at the faces before her. Each one represented a story of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. The woman who had once measured her worth by the careers she could destroy now found meaning in the lives she could help rebuild. The news that had shattered her world had also rebuilt it, transforming a cautionary tale of corporate cruelty into a story of redemption and purpose. The Chicago skyline still stretched toward the heavens, its towers still symbols of corporate power and achievement. But Sarah Maxwell now saw them differently. True power, she had learned, lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the courage to face oneself and change. Her journey from corporate destroyer to humble student of humanity had taught her what no business success ever could, that the greatest achievement is not in rising above others, but in helping others rise. The story of the heartless executive who mocked a wounded soldier would always be part of her legacy. But it was no longer the end of her story. Instead, it had become the beginning of a different kind of success story, one measured not in dollars and power, but in lives touched and hearts changed. Sarah Maxwell, who had once built her life on causing pain, had finally learned to build something better, a legacy of healing, hope, and genuine human connection. In the weeks following her public disgrace, Sarah Maxwell discovered that rebuilding a life was far more challenging than destroying one. Her severance package had provided financial security, but money could not buy back respect or trust. Each morning brought new challenges in her journey toward redemption, each day testing her commitment to change in ways she had never anticipated. The first test came when she decided to move out of her luxury hotel suite. The Peninsula Chicago had been her fortress of solitude during the crisis, but now its opulence felt suffocating. Sarah found herself a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of place she would have sneered at just months ago. The real estate agent was visibly shocked when Sarah Maxwell, former CEO and business mogul, signed the lease for a 2-bedroom walk-up above a family-owned grocery store. Moving day proved particularly humbling. Sarah had spent years accumulating the trappings of success, filling her life with expensive things that now seemed meaningless. She donated most of her designer wardrobe to women's shelters, keeping only the simplest pieces. Her collection of rare wines, carefully curated over years, went to a charity auction. Each item she gave away felt like shedding another layer of her old self, painful but necessary. The local press caught wind of her downsizing and turned it into another story. Some praised it as genuine change, others dismissed it as a publicity stunt. Sarah found herself doing something new, ignoring the media altogether. The woman who had once obsessively managed her public image now focused inward, searching for something more genuine than reputation management. Her first real step toward redemption began with a simple email to Michael Anderson's foundation. Sarah had drafted and deleted the message dozens of times, struggling to find words that could convey genuine remorse rather than corporate damage control. In the end, she sent something brutally honest, admitting she had no right to expect a response but offering whatever help she could provide. The reply came 3 days later, not from a staff member but from Michael himself. His words were direct but not unkind, suggesting a meeting to discuss possible ways forward. Sarah spent hours preparing for that meeting, not with PowerPoint presentations or business strategies, but with honest self-reflection. She wrote pages of notes about her own behavior, trying to understand the root of her cruelty. The coffee shop they chose for their meeting was far from the power lunch venues Sarah had frequented in her previous life. The furniture was worn, the coffee served in mismatched mugs, the clientele more focused on their conversations than their image. Sarah arrived early, dressed simply, her former armor of designer labels and perfect makeup replaced by business casual attire and a clean face. Michael arrived exactly on time, his presence drawing respectful nods from other patrons who recognized him from the news. Sarah stood to greet him, noticing details she had been too arrogant to see during their first encounter, the way he moved with practiced efficiency despite his missing arm. The quiet confidence in his bearing that had nothing to do with power or position, the kindness in his eyes even as they assessed her with military precision. Their conversation lasted hours, moving far beyond the simple apology Sarah had prepared. Michael shared stories of his military service, not the sanitized versions from news reports, but the raw reality of sacrifice and brotherhood. He spoke about waking up in the hospital, learning to navigate a world designed for two arms, and finding purpose in helping other veterans face similar challenges. Sarah found herself opening up in return, sharing truths she had buried beneath years of ambition. She told him about growing up poor, about watching repo men take their furniture, about swearing she would never be powerless again. The words poured out like a confession, each one stripping away another layer of the corporate mask she had worn for so long. By the end of their coffee shop meeting, Michael and Sarah had outlined something neither had expected: a partnership. Not the kind that would generate press releases or corporate accolades, but something more fundamental. Sarah would work with the foundation, using her business experience to help veterans transition into civilian careers. But first, Michael insisted, she needed to understand the community she would be serving. The following weeks transformed Sarah's understanding of service and sacrifice. Michael introduced her to his network of veterans, not in boardrooms or office buildings, but in rehabilitation centers and support group meetings. She met men and women facing challenges that made corporate takeovers seem trivial in comparison. A young Marine learning to walk with prosthetic legs. An Air Force pilot struggling with PTSD. A Navy corpsman adapting to civilian life after 3 combat tours. Each story struck Sarah differently, but none more than Amanda Torres, a former Army medic who had lost both legs saving her unit from an IED. Amanda's determination to become a doctor despite her injuries reminded Sarah of her own early drive to succeed. But where Sarah had channeled her ambition into destroying others, Amanda focused on healing. The contrast was both humbling and inspiring. The Foundation's work took Sarah into environments she had never imagined visiting. She spent mornings at VA hospitals, afternoons at therapy sessions, and evenings at support group meetings. Her designer briefcase now carried pamphlets about PTSD resources instead of merger documents. Her phone, once filled with market updates and corporate gossip, now held contact information for vocational counselors and disability advocates. The media noticed this shift in Sarah Maxwell's life, but their coverage had changed. Gone were the scathing headlines about corporate cruelty. Instead, local papers began running stories about the former CEO working quietly in veteran centers. Some remained skeptical, but others recognized the authenticity of her transformation. Sarah ignored both perspectives, focusing instead on the real work before her. Her first major project with the Foundation involved creating a mentorship program connecting veterans with business leaders. Sarah approached this task differently than she would have in her corporate life. Instead of focusing on metrics and publicity, she concentrated on individual matches, ensuring each veteran was paired with someone who could truly understand and support their goals. The program faced initial resistance from the corporate world. Many of Sarah's former colleagues were hesitant to work with someone they viewed as toxic. Others questioned the practicality of hiring veterans with physical or psychological challenges. Sarah confronted these prejudices directly, drawing on her own journey from ignorance to understanding. She shared stories of soldiers like Michael and Amanda, highlighting their resilience, adaptability, and leadership skills. Slowly, progress emerged. A manufacturing company hired 3 veterans, including a former infantry sergeant who now managed their logistics department. A tech startup brought on a cybersecurity specialist who had served in military intelligence. An accounting firm recruited a former military administrator who quickly became one of their most effective project managers. But the real transformation happened in quiet moments away from public view. Sarah spent hours helping veterans prepare for job interviews, teaching them to translate their military experience into civilian terms. She reviewed resumes, conducted mock interviews, and offered honest feedback. The woman who had once taken pleasure in intimidating subordinates now found fulfillment in building others' confidence. Her own confidence changed shape during this period. The aggressive self-assurance that had once dominated boardrooms gave way to something quieter but more genuine. Sarah learned to listen more than she spoke, to find strength in vulnerability rather than dominance. The expensive power suits gathered dust in her closet as she embraced a more authentic way of presenting herself to the world. The true test of Sarah's transformation came 6 months after the plane incident, when the foundation organized its first major corporate networking event. The venue was nothing like the luxury hotels where Sarah had once commanded attention. Instead, they chose a community center near the VA hospital, its modest surroundings reflecting the event's genuine purpose. Sarah found herself facing many of her former business associates, people who had once feared her or sought her favor. Now they watched with mixture of curiosity and skepticism as she guided veterans through the networking process. Some of these executives had been victims of her past cruelty, and their presence forced her to confront the real impact of her previous behavior. One encounter particularly struck home. James Peterson, an executive she had publicly humiliated during a merger negotiation 3 years ago, now ran a successful technology company. Sarah had expected him to refuse the foundation's invitation, but instead he arrived early, expressing genuine interest in hiring veterans for his IT department. When their paths crossed, Sarah forced herself to acknowledge her past behavior directly. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable but necessary. James spoke honestly about how her public takedown had affected him, his family, and his career. Sarah listened without defending herself, accepting the weight of her actions. By the end of their discussion, they had not only cleared the air, but also established a partnership that would eventually provide technology training for dozens of veterans. The foundation's work began to attract attention from unexpected quarters. Other corporations, seeing the success of the initial partnerships, reached out to participate. Sarah found herself conducting workshops for business leaders, teaching them about the unique value veterans could bring to their organizations. She shared her own story as a cautionary tale, using her past mistakes to illustrate the importance of compassionate leadership. Her daily routine now revolved around making amends, not through grand gestures or public statements, but through consistent, meaningful action. Early mornings found her at the VA hospital, meeting with veterans preparing for job interviews. Afternoons were spent coordinating with companies, ensuring that their veteran hiring programs offered real opportunities rather than empty promises. Evenings often involved support group meetings, where Sarah learned to listen more than speak. The foundation expanded its services beyond job placement. Sarah worked with Michael to develop programs addressing the whole spectrum of challenges facing veterans returning to civilian life. They created partnerships with mental health providers, housing assistance organizations, and educational institutions. Each new initiative taught Sarah more about the true meaning of service and leadership. Working alongside Amanda Torres proved particularly transformative. The former Army medic had completed her medical school prerequisites despite her injuries and was now preparing for her MCAT. Sarah found herself learning as much as she was teaching. Amanda's perspective on overcoming obstacles, on finding strength in vulnerability, reshaped Sarah's understanding of what real courage looked like. The media periodically checked in on Sarah's progress, expecting perhaps to find that her reformation was merely a public relations strategy. Instead, they found someone fundamentally changed by genuine involvement in the veteran community. Local news outlets began running feature stories about the Foundation's success stories, with Sarah deliberately staying in the background, letting the veterans take center stage. One reporter, digging for controversy, uncovered Sarah's new living arrangements. The story they planned to write about her downsized lifestyle turned instead into a piece about authentic transformation. They found a woman who had traded power lunches for brown bag meetings with veterans, designer suits for casual business attire, and most significantly, arrogance for humility. The Foundation's impact grew beyond individual success stories. Companies that had implemented their veteran hiring programs reported improved workplace culture and stronger team dynamics. Military leadership skills, it turned out, translated remarkably well into corporate environments when given the proper chance. Sarah found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for workplace culture change, using her own transformation as evidence that change was possible at both individual and organizational levels. The most profound changes in Sarah's transformation occurred in moments far from public view. Late one evening, while helping a young veteran prepare for a job interview, she found herself sharing stories about her own father's struggles with poverty. The veteran, who had grown up in similar circumstances, connected with her story in a way that transcended their different paths. It was the first time Sarah had spoken about her background without using it as justification for her later cruelty. These connections began happening more frequently. Sarah discovered that many veterans came from backgrounds similar to hers. They too had faced economic hardship, limited opportunities, and societal barriers. But where she had chosen to climb over others to escape her circumstances, they had learned to lift each other up. This realization sparked something new in Sarah, a desire to understand rather than judge, to help rather than dominate. The Foundation's office became a second home to Sarah, though it bore no resemblance to her former corporate surroundings. The walls displayed military unit flags and thank you letters rather than stock certificates and awards. The coffee was store brand rather than artisanal, served in mugs decorated with military emblems. The conversations focused on changing lives rather than closing deals. One particular program became Sarah's personal mission. She noticed that many veterans struggled with the psychological aspect of job interviews, particularly those dealing with PTSD or visible injuries. Drawing on her years of corporate experience, Sarah developed a comprehensive interview preparation program. But unlike her previous training sessions, which had focused on domination and power plays, these workshops emphasized authenticity and strength through vulnerability. The program proved remarkably successful. Veterans learned to present their military experience as valuable business assets. They practiced discussing their injuries or psychological challenges in ways that highlighted their resilience rather than their limitations. Sarah found herself learning alongside them, discovering that true strength often lay in acknowledging rather than hiding one's struggles. A turning point came when a major business magazine requested an interview about the Foundation's work. The old Sarah would have seized this opportunity for personal publicity. Instead, she arranged for several successful program graduates to be interviewed alongside her. The resulting article focused on their achievements rather than her redemption story, exactly as she had intended. The corporate world began to take notice of the Foundation's success rate. Companies reported that veterans hired through their program showed exceptional leadership skills, crisis management abilities, and team-building capabilities. Sarah found herself fielding calls from CEOs who had once feared her, now seeking advice on implementing veteran hiring initiatives in their own organizations. Her relationship with Michael evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect. They often discussed the irony of how their chance encounter, beginning with her cruelty, had led to such unexpected positive changes. Michael's steady influence helped Sarah navigate the challenges of her transformation, particularly when old habits threatened to resurface. The Foundation's annual review revealed impressive statistics. Hundreds of veterans placed in meaningful careers. Dozens of corporate partnerships established. Millions of dollars in salaries and benefits secured for program participants. But the numbers that meant the most to Sarah were not in any official report. They were the smiles of confidence on veterans' faces before interviews, the tears of joy at job offers, the proud updates from those who had found their footing in civilian careers. As the one-year anniversary of the plane incident approached, Sarah received an unexpected invitation. A national veterans organization wanted her to speak at their annual convention. The old Sarah would have immediately begun crafting a speech to enhance her image. Instead, she spent time reflecting on what message would truly serve the veteran community. The day before the convention, Sarah visited her old office building in Chicago. Standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the glass tower where she had once ruled through fear, she hardly recognized her former self. The woman who had mocked a wounded soldier seemed like a stranger now. The path from that moment to her current reality had been painful but necessary, a journey from power to purpose. In her small apartment that evening, Sarah prepared for her speech not by rehearsing power poses or practicing authoritative tones, but by reading through the countless messages she had received from veterans whose lives had intersected with hers through the Foundation. Each story reminded her that true leadership had nothing to do with instilling fear and everything to do with inspiring hope. The woman who would take the stage the next day was neither the cruel executive she had been nor some perfectly reformed saint. She was simply someone who had learned, through hard experience and genuine effort, that the measure of a person lay not in their ability to dominate others but in their willingness to serve them. The news that had shattered her world had also rebuilt it, transforming a cautionary tale of corporate cruelty into an ongoing story of redemption, purpose, and genuine human connection. 2 years after the plane incident that had shattered her world, Sarah Maxwell stood at a podium quite different from those she had commanded in her corporate life. The convention center was filled not with business executives but with veterans, their families, and supporters. The audience included Michael Anderson in the front row, his empty sleeve now a symbol not of her past cruelty but of the transformation it had sparked. The Foundation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What began as a small initiative born from Sarah's disgrace had blossomed into a national movement, changing not just individual lives but the very culture of corporate America. Companies that had once viewed hiring veterans as mere public relations now actively sought them out, having seen the impact of military leadership in civilian settings. Sarah's speech that day was not about herself. Instead, she shared the stories of countless veterans who had passed through the Foundation's programs. She spoke about Mark Thompson, a former Marine who now ran operations for a Fortune 500 company. She told the audience about Jennifer Rodriguez, an Army veteran who had started her own successful tech company after completing their training program. Each success story represented not just individual triumph, but a broader change in how society viewed and valued military service. The numbers told part of the story. Over 2,000 veterans placed in meaningful careers. More than 300 corporate partnerships established. Millions in salaries and benefits secured for program participants. But the real impact lay in the changes that couldn't be quantified. The renewed sense of purpose in veterans' eyes. The strengthened bonds between military and civilian communities. The gradual transformation of corporate culture from cutthroat competition to collaborative strength. Looking out at the sea of faces before her, Sarah saw not just an audience but a community that had taught her the true meaning of leadership. The woman who had once measured success by the careers she destroyed now found fulfillment in the lives she helped rebuild. Each face in the crowd represented a story of resilience, courage, and determination that had become part of her own journey of redemption. Behind the podium, Sarah felt none of the old arrogance that had once powered her public speeches. Instead, she experienced something new, genuine connection with her audience. She shared vulnerable moments from her own transformation, not for sympathy or acclaim, but as proof that change was possible even for those who seemed furthest from redemption. The Foundation's work had rippled through corporate America in unexpected ways. Major companies that had once epitomized cutthroat business practices now showcased their veteran hiring programs as models of organizational transformation. Sarah's own journey from corporate tyrant to compassionate leader became a case study in business schools, though she declined most requests to speak about it directly. Her former industry colleagues watched this evolution with varying degrees of skepticism and surprise. Some dismissed it as an elaborate reputation rehabilitation scheme, but others recognized the authenticity of the change. Several of her former competitors had become unlikely allies in the Foundation's mission, opening their companies to veteran recruitment and training programs. The most significant impact came in the form of cultural change within organizations. Companies that hired veterans through the Foundation's programs reported unexpected benefits. Military leadership styles, focused on mission accomplishment and team welfare, began influencing corporate management practices. The emphasis on collective success over individual achievement challenged traditional business paradigms. Sarah's own transformation continued to deepen through daily interactions with the veteran community. The woman who had once occupied a corner office in Manhattan now spent most of her time in rehabilitation centers, training rooms, and veterans' hospitals. Her designer wardrobe had been permanently replaced by practical business casual attire. Her power suits donated to programs helping veterans transition to civilian careers. The Foundation's headquarters reflected this shift in priorities. Located in a renovated warehouse rather than a glossy office tower, the space was designed for functionality rather than intimidation. Meeting rooms displayed maps marking successful placements across the country. The walls featured photographs of veterans in their new civilian roles, their success stories written beneath each image. The media's interest in Sarah's story had evolved from scandal to social impact. Business journals that had once chronicled her corporate conquests now reported on the Foundation's innovative approaches to veteran employment. The annual report, once a document designed to intimidate competitors, became a celebration of community achievement and individual triumph. The Foundation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What began as a small initiative born from Sarah's disgrace had blossomed into a national movement, changing not just individual lives but the very culture of corporate America. Companies that had once viewed hiring veterans as mere public relations now actively sought them out, having seen the impact of military leadership in civilian settings. Sarah's speech that day was not about herself. Instead, she shared the stories of countless veterans who had passed through the Foundation's programs. She spoke about Mark Thompson, a former Marine who now ran operations for a Fortune 500 company. She told the audience about Jennifer Rodriguez, an Army veteran who had started her own successful tech company after completing their training program. Each success story represented not just individual triumph, but a broader change in how society viewed and valued military service. The numbers told part of the story. Over 2,000 veterans placed in meaningful careers. More than 300 corporate partnerships established. Millions in salaries and benefits secured for program participants. But the real impact lay in the changes that couldn't be quantified. The renewed sense of purpose in veterans' eyes. The strengthened bonds between military and civilian communities, the gradual transformation of corporate culture from cutthroat competition to collaborative strength. Looking out at the sea of faces before her, Sarah saw not just an audience but a community that had taught her the true meaning of leadership. The woman who had once measured success by the careers she destroyed now found fulfillment in the lives she helped rebuild. Each face in the crowd represented a story of resilience, courage, and determination that had become part of her own journey of redemption. Behind the podium, Sarah felt none of the old arrogance that had once powered her public speeches. Instead, she experienced something new, genuine connection with her audience. She shared vulnerable moments from her own transformation, not for sympathy or acclaim, but as proof that change was possible even for those who seemed furthest from redemption. The Foundation's work had rippled through corporate America in unexpected ways. Major companies that had once epitomized cutthroat business practices now showcased their veteran hiring programs as models of organizational transformation. Sarah's own journey from corporate tyrant to compassionate leader became a case study in business schools, though she declined most requests to speak about it directly. Her former industry colleagues watched this evolution with varying degrees of skepticism and surprise. Some dismissed it as an elaborate reputation rehabilitation scheme, but others recognized the authenticity of the change. Several of her former competitors had become unlikely allies in the Foundation's mission, opening their companies to veteran recruitment and training programs. The most significant impact came in the form of cultural change within organizations. Companies that hired veterans through the Foundation's programs reported unexpected benefits. Military leadership styles, focused on mission accomplishment and team welfare, began influencing corporate management practices. The emphasis on collective success over individual achievement challenged traditional business paradigms. Sarah's own transformation continued to deepen through daily interactions with the veteran community. The woman who had once occupied a corner office in Manhattan now spent most of her time in rehabilitation centers, training rooms, and veterans' hospitals. Her designer wardrobe had been permanently replaced by practical business casual attire. Her power suits donated to programs helping veterans transition to civilian careers. The Foundation's headquarters reflected this shift in priorities. Located in a renovated warehouse rather than a glossy office tower, the space was designed for functionality rather than intimidation. Meeting rooms displayed maps marking successful placements across the country. The walls featured photographs of veterans in their new civilian roles, their success stories written beneath each image. The media's interest in Sarah's story had evolved from scandal to social impact. Business journals that had once chronicled her corporate conquests now reported on the Foundation's innovative approaches to veteran employment. The annual report, once a document designed to intimidate competitors, became a celebration of community achievement and individual triumph. The Foundation's success stories became legends in both military and business communities. There was the story of David Chen, a former Navy SEAL who had lost both legs in combat. Through the Foundation's program, he not only secured a position as a cybersecurity executive, but went on to develop innovative training programs for other disabled veterans. His success inspired dozens of technology companies to actively recruit veterans with disabilities, recognizing that physical limitations often masked extraordinary capabilities. Another breakthrough came through the story of Maria Hernandez, an Army veteran struggling with PTSD. Sarah worked closely with her, recognizing in Maria's determination the same drive that had once fueled her own climb to corporate power. Unlike Sarah's path of destruction, Maria channeled her energy into creating a peer support network within the corporate world. Her initiative spread to 30 major companies, helping hundreds of veterans navigate the challenges of civilian workplace culture. The Foundation's annual conference had grown from a modest gathering to a major event in both military and business calendars. CEOs who had once avoided association with veteran causes now competed for speaking slots, eager to share their company's success stories. Sarah watched this transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and humility, knowing that her moment of cruelty had paradoxically sparked a movement of compassion. Personal relationships formed the heart of the Foundation's impact. Sarah maintained regular contact with many of the veterans who had passed through their programs. She celebrated their promotions, attended their weddings, and sometimes simply listened when the weight of transition became too heavy. These connections, built on genuine care rather than professional networking, revealed to her the true meaning of success. The Foundation's mentorship program became particularly renowned. Sarah had designed it based on her own journey, pairing veterans not just with business leaders, but with other veterans who had successfully navigated the corporate world. The program boasted a 90% success rate, with most participants not only finding employment but advancing rapidly in their chosen fields. Michael Anderson's role evolved as well. His quiet leadership style complemented Sarah's transformed approach, creating a partnership that bridged military and civilian perspectives. Together, they developed new programs addressing the full spectrum of transition challenges. Their collaboration became a model for other organizations, demonstrating how different leadership styles could create stronger outcomes. The Foundation's research division, established in the third year, began publishing groundbreaking studies on veteran employment. Their findings challenged common misconceptions about military service and workplace capability. Companies learned that veterans with PTSD often showed exceptional crisis management skills, that those with combat experience frequently excelled at strategic planning, and that military leadership training translated remarkably well to corporate environments. Sarah's personal growth continued through unexpected challenges. When a prominent business magazine wanted to feature her as a reformed corporate villain, she declined the opportunity for publicity. Instead, she arranged for them to interview a group of veteran entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses through the Foundation's support. Her focus had shifted entirely from personal recognition to program impact. The Foundation's work with wounded warriors became particularly meaningful. Sarah spent countless hours working with veterans learning to adapt to physical limitations. She watched in awe as they transformed these challenges into opportunities, developing new approaches to traditional business problems. Their resilience and creativity often brought her back to that moment on the plane, reminding her how thoroughly wrong her previous judgments had been. The impact on corporate culture spread beyond veteran hiring. Companies participating in the Foundation's programs reported improved team dynamics, more effective leadership approaches, and stronger organizational resilience. Military concepts like unit cohesion and mission focus began influencing management strategies. The Foundation's training materials were adapted by business schools, integrating military leadership principles into standard business education. Sarah's own leadership style underwent continuous evolution. She learned to balance the efficiency of her business background with the compassion she had discovered through her work with veterans. Her decisions now considered not just outcomes, but impacts, not just results, but relationships. The woman who had once ruled through fear now led through understanding and empathy. 5 years after the plane incident, Sarah returned to that same Chicago airport. The memories of that day no longer brought shame, but served as a reminder of how far she had come. The terminal, where she had once strutted in designer heels, treating others with contempt, now hosted one of the Foundation's veteran support centers. The small office, nestled between coffee shops and newsstands, provided guidance and resources to veterans traveling through the airport. The Foundation's airport program had become one of their most successful initiatives. What started as a small support center in Chicago had expanded to 30 major airports across the country. Veterans in transit could find everything from career counseling to peer support, turning travel hubs into networks of assistance and understanding. The idea had come from a young Marine veteran who remembered feeling lost and alone during his own transition to civilian life. Sarah's daily routine now bore no resemblance to her former corporate lifestyle. Her mornings often began at VA hospitals, working with recently discharged veterans. Afternoons might find her in corporate boardrooms, but now she entered as an advocate rather than a conqueror. Evenings were frequently spent at support group meetings or mentoring sessions, where the real work of transformation happened one conversation at a time. The Foundation's impact extended beyond American borders. Military organizations from other countries began studying their model, sending representatives to learn how to better support their own veterans. Sarah found herself traveling internationally, not to close business deals but to help establish similar programs in other nations. The woman who had once viewed the world as a battlefield for corporate conquest now saw it as a network of communities supporting those who had served. Personal connections remained at the heart of their mission. Sarah kept in touch with hundreds of veterans who had passed through their programs. She celebrated their successes, supported them through setbacks, and learned from their experiences. Each story added new dimensions to her understanding of service, sacrifice, and redemption. The relationships she built were genuine and lasting, unlike the superficial networks she had once cultivated for business advantage. The Foundation's headquarters had become a hub of innovation in veteran support. The building hummed with activity as teams developed new programs, refined existing initiatives, and responded to emerging needs in the veteran community. The walls displayed not just success stories, but lessons learned, challenges overcome, and goals for the future. Every corner of the space reflected their commitment to practical, meaningful support for veterans in transition. Michael Anderson's role had evolved alongside the Foundation's growth. His quiet strength and unwavering integrity continued to guide their mission. The partnership between him and Sarah became a symbol of how military and civilian perspectives could combine to create powerful, positive change. Their different backgrounds and experiences, once a source of conflict, now provided complementary approaches to problem solving. The corporate world's transformation continued to exceed expectations. Companies that had adopted the Foundation's veteran hiring programs reported improved performance across all metrics. Military leadership principles began influencing management practices throughout American business. The emphasis on mission accomplishment, team welfare, and ethical decision-making gradually replaced the cutthroat practices that had once dominated corporate culture. Sarah's own transformation remained ongoing. Each day brought new lessons in humility, compassion, and genuine leadership. The woman who had once measured success in dollars and decimated careers now found fulfillment in moments of human connection and growth. Her understanding of power had fundamentally shifted from domination to service, from taking to giving. The Foundation's research continued to break new ground in understanding veteran employment. Their studies revealed that companies with significant veteran leadership showed greater resilience during crises, stronger team cohesion, and more ethical decision-making practices. These findings helped reshape corporate attitudes toward military service, transforming veteran status from a potential liability to a valuable asset. Educational institutions began incorporating the Foundation's insights into their curricula. Business schools added courses on military leadership principles. MBA programs invited veteran graduates to share their experiences. The gap between military and civilian perspectives began to narrow as understanding grew on both sides. The annual gathering of Foundation alumni became a powerful demonstration of their impact. Hundreds of veterans who had found their paths through their programs returned to share their stories and mentor others. The event grew from a simple ceremony to a week-long conference, attracting participants from across the country and around the world. Sarah's original moment of cruelty had been transformed into a catalyst for widespread positive change. The incident that could have defined her life as a cautionary tale instead became the beginning of a movement that touched thousands of lives. The news that had shattered her world had actually rebuilt it into something far more meaningful than she could have imagined. Looking back on that fateful plane ride, Sarah now understood that her greatest failure had led to her most important success. The journey from corporate destroyer to community builder had been challenging and often painful, but it had led to authentic fulfillment. Her life had become proof that transformation was possible, that past mistakes could become stepping stones to meaningful change. As she stood in the airport where it all began, Sarah reflected on the strange paths that life could take. The moment that had seemed like the end of her world had actually been its beginning. The news that had shattered everything she thought she knew about success had taught her what real achievement meant. And the soldier she had once mocked had become not just a catalyst for change, but a partner in creating something truly meaningful. The Foundation's work continued to evolve, responding to new challenges and opportunities. But its core mission remained unchanged, supporting those who had served while building bridges between military and civilian worlds. Sarah's role had become that of a guide, helping others navigate their own journeys of transformation and growth. Her story served as a reminder that change was possible, that redemption was achievable, and that purpose could emerge from even the darkest moments. Sarah Maxwell's story shows that transformation is possible when we confront our mistakes and choose growth over fear. Support veterans' transitions by volunteering, donating, or hiring them in your organization. Foster compassionate leadership in your workplace and community by leading with empathy. Challenge stereotypes, advocate for inclusive practices, and amplify organizations helping those in need. Start today. Your actions can create ripples of change and build a world of hope and resilience.